Challenges of traveling westward. In the mid-1800s, Americans moved westward to settle the vast expanse of land west of the Mississippi River. The challenges of this westward expansion were numerous and multifaceted, ranging from physical difficulties of traversing the rugged terrain to the political and social challenges of settling a new frontier. One of the most significant challenges of westward expansion was the physical difficulty of traversing the vast and rugged terrain. The journey westward was long, often requiring settlers to travel hundreds or even thousands of miles over rough terrain, through dangerous wilderness, and across treacherous rivers. Settlers had to contend with harsh weather, hostile Native American tribes, and disease, all of which made the journey westward a perilous undertaking. Another major challenge was the lack of infrastructure in the West. Unlike the more established eastern states, the western territories lacked roads, bridges, and other infrastructure necessary for settlement and commerce. Settlers had to build their own homes, clear land for farming, and create their own communities from scratch. This lack of infrastructure also made transportation and communication difficult, further isolating settlers from the rest of the country. Perhaps the most significant challenge of westward expansion was the political and social challenges of settling a new frontier. As Americans moved westward, they came into contact with Native American tribes, many of whom resisted the encroachment of settlers onto their land. The resulting conflicts were often violent and prolonged, leading to the displacement and even genocide of Native American communities. Additionally, westward expansion brought with it new questions about the role of the federal government in regulating the newly settled territories. As the country expanded westward, Congress had to grapple with how to govern new territories, whether to allow slavery in these territories, and how to balance the interests of eastern and western states. These debates would ultimately lead to the Civil War, which in turn would shape the course of American history for decades to come. Reasons for Americans to travel westward. Despite these challenges, Americans continued to move westward in the mid-1800s. There were several reasons for this migration. For one, many Americans were drawn by the prospect of acquiring land. The Homestead Act of 1862, which offered free land to anyone willing to settle and improve it, made it easier for Americans to acquire land in the West. Additionally, the discovery of gold in California in 1849 and in other Western territories throughout the 1850s and 1860s attracted thousands of prospectors and miners to the region in search of wealth. Another reason for westward expansion was the promise of adventure and new opportunities. For many Americans, the West represented a chance to start anew, to reinvent themselves in a new environment, and to escape the constraints of Eastern society. This desire for adventure and opportunity was particularly strong among young men who were drawn to the West in search of excitement, challenge, and the chance to prove themselves. Removal of Native American tribes. The westward expansion of America brought on a very dark time in American history, which was the forced removal of the Native American tribes that lived there originally. This policy of removal was driven by a combination of factors, including the desire for land and resources, racial prejudice, and a belief in the superiority of Western civilization. One of the key mechanisms of this removal policy was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the U.S. government to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes that would exchange their ancestral lands in the eastern United States for new lands west of the Mississippi River. These negotiations were often one-sided and coerced, with the U.S. government using threats and force to compel Native American tribes to agree to removal. Once these treaties were signed, Native American tribes were forced to leave their homelands and make the treacherous journey westward to unfamiliar and often inhospitable lands. This journey, which became known as the Trail of Tears, was marked by tremendous suffering and loss of life. Many Native Americans died of disease, exposure, and starvation, while others were attacked by hostile whites and military forces. Even after they arrived in their new territories, Native Americans continued to face discrimination and hostility from whites. They were often denied their rights of citizenship, restricted in their ability to practice their own religions and cultures, and subject to forced assimilation programs aimed at eradicating their traditional ways of life. Economy in the United States. The late 1800s saw the United States become one of the most industrialized countries in the world. The country was able to build an industrial economy due to a combination of factors, including the availability of natural resources, a growing population, and a favorable economic climate. One of the primary factors that enabled the U.S. to build an industrial economy was the abundance of natural resources. The country had vast reserves of coal, iron, oil, and other minerals that were essential for industrial production. This enabled U.S. companies to produce goods at a lower cost than their competitors, which gave them a competitive advantage in the global market. Another factor that contributed to the growth of the U.S. economy was the country's large and growing population. The U.S. had a rapidly expanding workforce, which meant that there was a ready supply of labor for new industries. Additionally, the country had a high level of immigration during this period, which helped to fuel economic growth. The U.S. also had a favorable economic climate that supported the growth of new industries. For example, railroads allowed farmers to sell their goods in distant markets. However, as the use of the railroads expanded, so did the cost, causing farmers to complain bitterly about the constantly raising prices. The government passed laws and policies that encouraged the growth of business and protected the rights of entrepreneurs. For example, the government provided land grants to railroads, which helped to connect the country and facilitate the transportation of goods. Additionally, the government passed laws that protected intellectual property rights, which encouraged innovation and entrepreneurship. The government also passed the Hepburn Act, which gave the federal government considerable power over the railroad industry. In the late 19th century, America saw the most important development in communications, the telephone. The second half of the 19th century saw the emergence of a new economic system in the West that was characterized by several distinctive features. Industrialization. The West experienced rapid industrialization during this period. This was characterized by the growth of large factories, the introduction of new technologies, and the mass production of goods. Urbanization. The growth of industrialization led to a massive influx of people into urban areas. Cities became centers of commerce, and new urban infrastructure was developed to support the growing population. Globalization. The growth of industrialization and urbanization led to an increased trade and globalization. The West became more connected to other regions of the world, and international trade grew significantly. Capitalism. This new economy was based on capitalism, which emphasized free markets, private property, and competition. This led to the rise of entrepreneurs and the development of new business models. Banking and finance. The growth of capitalism led to the development of new financial institutions, including banks, stock markets, and investment firms. These institutions played a critical role in funding the growth of industry and commerce. Labor. The growth of industry led to the development of a new class of industrial workers. These workers were often exploited and worked long hours in unsafe conditions. The labor movement emerged during this period in response to these conditions. There were experts who dedicated themselves to industrial efficiency. An example of one of these people is Frederick Winslow Taylor. As the U.S. industrialized, a new class of wage earners emerged. These workers were employed in factories, mines, and other industrial settings, and they were paid a wage for their labor. The wage earners in this new economy were diverse and included immigrants, women, and children. Immigrants played a significant role in the new economy, as they were willing to work for lower wages than native-born workers. Immigrants from Europe and Asia arrived in the U.S. in large numbers during this period, and many of them found work in the country's factories and mines. Women also entered the workforce in significant numbers during this period. Many women found employment in textile mills and other factories, where they worked long hours for low wages. Women also worked in the home, where they performed domestic tasks such as cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Children were also employed in the new economy, particularly in industries such as mining and textile manufacturing. Child labor was common during this period, and many children worked long hours in dangerous conditions for low wages. Despite the growth of the U.S. economy during this period, many wage earners faced difficult working conditions and low wages. Labor unions emerged during this period to advocate for workers' rights and improve working conditions. Unions used strikes and other tactics to pressure employers to improve wages and working conditions, which helped to create a more equitable society. The late 1800s saw the emergence of the steel and oil industries in the United States, which played a significant role in the country's economic growth. The steel industry was characterized by mass production techniques that enabled companies to produce large quantities of steel at a lower cost. This is because steel companies often controlled every aspect of the production process, from mining the iron ore to shipping the finished product. The steel industry also saw many innovations during this period, including the Bessemer process, which made it possible to produce high-quality steel at a lower cost. The steel industry was characterized by consolidation, as smaller companies were acquired by larger companies. This led to the emergence of a few dominant players in the industry, such as U.S. Steel. The oil industry was characterized by exploration and drilling activities, as companies searched for oil reserves. Transportation. The oil industry was dependent on transportation networks to move oil from the well to refineries, who refined crude oil into usable products such as gasoline, kerosene, and lubricants, and finally to consumers. The oil industry was dominated by a few large companies such as Standard Oil, which controlled much of the production and distribution of oil. Despite this, the oil industry was marked by intense competition, which sometimes led to price wars between companies. The major growth of the oil industry also led to increased regulation, as the government sought to ensure that companies operated in a safe and environmentally responsible manner. Labor unions. The period from 1870 to 1900 was a time of significant growth for the labor movement in the United States. During this period, workers organized themselves into unions and began to fight for better working conditions, higher wages, and more rights in the workplace. In the 1870s, a number of early labor organizations emerged, such as National Labor Union and the Knights of Labor, the group that is most affiliated with the Agrarian Revolt. These organizations sought to improve working conditions and wages for workers. In 1886, a labor protest in Chicago called the Haymarket Riot turned violent when a bomb exploded, killing several people. The incident led to a crackdown on labor unions by the government and businesses. Another thing that happened in 1886 was the formation of the ALF. In 1877, railway workers recognized that labor protests are their rights as citizens. The AFL, American Federation of Labor, was formed as a federation of different trade unions. The AFL focused on collective bargaining and improving wages and working conditions for skilled workers. In 1894, workers at the Pullman Palace Car Company went on strike to protest wage cuts and poor working conditions. The strike spread to other industries, leading to a national crisis that required government intervention to end. This was known as the Pullman Strike. In 1905, the IWW was formed as a union that aimed to organize all workers into a single union. The IWW was known for its radical approach to labor organization and its emphasis on direct action and strikes. Women and children played a significant role in the labor movement during this period. They worked in textile mills and other industries and faced poor working conditions and low wages. The Gilded Age. The period from 1877 to 1900 in American history is often referred to as the Gilded Age, which saw significant growth and transformation of American cities. The growth of American cities during this period had a profound impact on social, cultural, and political life in several ways. Socially, the growth of American cities created new opportunities for people from different backgrounds to interact with each other. This led to the emergence of new cultural practices and social norms as people from different ethnic, racial, and socioeconomic backgrounds came into contact with each other. However, the rapid influx of people into cities also led to overcrowding, poor living conditions, and increased crime rates, which affected the quality of life of many urban residents. Culturally, the growth of American cities led to the emergence of new forms of popular culture, including theater, music, and sports. The availability of new forms of entertainment reflected the changing tastes and values of urban Americans, who were increasingly interested in mass-produced, commercialized forms of culture. This also led to the rise of consumer culture, as people began to buy goods and services based on their desires and preferences rather than necessity. At this time, typical entertainment for Americans was for the family to gather in the living room for family games, such as cards, dominoes, chess. A sentimental ballad was the most popular form of music. The popularity of ragtime reflected the influence of new urban culture. Fairs, horse races, balloon ascensions, bicycle tournaments, and football and baseball contests attracted avid fans. Baseball grew in popularity and became increasingly professionalized. As gas and electric lights brightened the night and streetcars crisscrossed the city streets, leisure habits changed. Politically, the growth of American cities played a significant role in shaping the political landscape of the country. The influx of immigrants into cities led to the emergence of new political movements, such as Tammany Hall in New York City, which sought to represent the interest of urban residents. Additionally, the rapid growth of cities led to the development of new forms of municipal government, as urban leaders sought to address the challenges associated with urbanization. After the end of Reconstruction, which aimed to rebuild and integrate the Southern states after the Civil War, Jim Crow laws spread across the South. These laws enforced racial segregation and discrimination against African Americans and institutionalized white supremacy. The following factors contributed to the rise of Jim Crow laws. Political disenfranchisement. Southern states used various tactics, such as poll taxes and literacy tests, to disenfranchise African American voters. This allowed white politicians to gain and maintain power and pass laws that benefited white people and oppressed African Americans. Supreme Court rulings. The Supreme Court issued several rulings that supported segregation and discrimination, including the Plessy v. Ferguson 1896 case, which upheld the constitutionality of separate but equal facilities. Economic changes. After Reconstruction, the South experienced economic hardship, and many white Southerners blamed African Americans for their problems. This led to increased racial tensions and animosity towards African Americans. Social norms. White supremacy was deeply ingrained in Southern society, and many white people believed that segregation was necessary to maintain social order and prevent racial mixing.